I'm 34, and I spent years thinking love meant giving everything, even when it left me empty. I carried everyone's pain like it was my own, begged for scraps of kindness, and swallowed the cold words like they were water. But he never saw me, never thanked me, just took, mocked my sacrifices with a smirk, dismissed my worth with every cruel word. "You're too sensitive," he'd say, like my feelings were a joke. I'm tired, so damn tired. But tonight, something inside me cracked. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who deserves more. Hi, I'm Maya, and this is the moment I choose me. I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, loved hard enough, you'd be rewarded, that some kind of karmic equation would tip in your favor eventually. I held on to that belief for years. It was the glue that kept me tethered to a life that, in hindsight, had slowly stopped including me. Our mornings were a blur of routine. Emails, school lunches, matching socks, lukewarm coffee gulped between carpool and conference calls. My husband Daniel always had a sense of purpose. He wore it like cologne. Even when he wasn't trying, he took up space in a room, made his presence known. I used to love that about him. It made me feel chosen. Now I'm not so sure. We'd been married for 14 years. Long enough for the memory of firsts, first kiss, first vacation, first fight, to dull into rituals. I used to tuck away date night receipts and handwritten notes like precious artifacts. Somewhere along the way, they stopped coming. Life shifted from passion to partnership, then from partnership to performance. Smiles for the kids, shared calendars, side-by-side scrolling before bed. The spark faded without a sound. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly, just muted, like living underwater. I'd grown so used to swallowing my wants I stopped recognizing them. My friends would talk about yoga retreats or spontaneous trips. I'd laugh along, pretending I didn't ache to disappear for a week, alone, just to remember who I was before this life claimed me. Daniel was busy. Always busy. Business dinners, product launches, quick trips that sometimes turned into weekend-long absences. I told myself this was the price of ambition. And to be fair, I'd let my own career shrink to part-time consulting so I could be present for the family. It wasn't a sacrifice at first. It felt right. Noble even. But slowly, that noble choice began to feel like a shrinking room, closing in on me. The funny thing is, you can sense when something shifts. It's not always a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it's just the silence, the delayed responses, the way he started locking his phone. I told myself I was imagining it. Paranoia wasn't my style. I'd always prided myself on being rational, balanced. But one night, as we lay in bed with our backs to each other, I realized I hadn't felt his eyes on me in months. And yet, I kept moving, grocery runs, PTA meetings, late-night laundry. I filled the silence with chores and to-do lists, convincing myself it would pass, that we were just in a phase. Everyone has phases. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. It was raining, drizzling really. One of those soft, persistent showers that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. Daniel texted me mid-afternoon. Running. Late. In a meeting. Don't wait up. But something didn't sit right. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time my gut screamed. I stared at the message for a long time. My hands went cold. I wanted to cry, scream, demand answers, but instead I responded, "Okay, be safe." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the edge of our bed, phone in hand, heart pounding like a drumbeat from another life. I knew. I didn't need proof. But still, I waited. I waited because I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed the right moment. Not to catch him, not to hurt him, but to reclaim me. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about all the times I'd silenced myself, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to make the marriage bigger. I needed to remember the woman I was before the compromises, before the resentment wore her down. I didn't know what I would do yet. I only knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of me. The next day, I didn't ask questions. I made waffles, packed lunches, and reminded our son not to forget his sneakers for gym. Daniel moved through the morning like nothing had happened, like he hadn't come home at 1:13 a.m. reeking of cologne that wasn't his or mine. He showered before crawling into bed, but scent lingers, doesn't it? It clings to skin, and guilt clings harder. Watched him over coffee. He scrolled through emails like always, kissed the top of my head on his way out, murmured, "Love you." The words felt foreign, like something said out of obligation, not affection. I didn't respond, just nodded. That night, I finally allowed myself to follow the gut feeling. Not rage-fueled or impulsive, just calm and clear. I checked our phone bill. We shared a plan, had for years. He probably forgot. Or maybe he thought I wouldn't look. Maybe he still believed I was the woman too preoccupied with managing everyone else's lives to notice the fault lines in her own. There were dozens of texts to a number I didn't recognize, at all hours. Lunch breaks, midnight, early mornings. The kind of frequency you don't share with a colleague. The contact was saved as Derek, but I knew better. My breath caught as I scrolled. I felt stupid. No, worse. I felt erased. I copied the number and searched it. Social media did the rest. Her name was Lena. She worked in marketing, blonde, polished, the kind of smile that's too perfect to be trustworthy. I went through her photos like a woman possessed, my heart burning with every new revelation. There they were, Daniel and Lena, at a rooftop event I wasn't able to attend because he told me it was last minute. In one picture, his hand rested on the small of her back, his body angled toward her like gravity itself had chosen sides. My stomach turned. I closed. The browser turned off my phone and sat in the dark for a long time. My mind didn't spiral the way I thought it would. There was no screaming, no crying, just a deep, bone-weary ache that settled into my chest like concrete. 14 years, a house, a son, a life I'd built with both hands while he slipped away without even saying goodbye. But I didn't fall apart. That surprised me the most. The next morning, I packed his gym bag, laid out his vitamins like always. Routine is funny that way. It keeps you steady when everything inside you is unraveling. I was waiting for the right moment, the one that would be mine. Not a confrontation born out of chaos or emotional eruption, but one anchored in control, in clarity. That moment came sooner than I expected. It was Saturday. Daniel was heading out to meet a client for brunch, the same lie wrapped in different packaging. I kissed his cheek and said, "Drive safe." My voice was calm, so calm it scared me. Then I did something I'd never done before. I followed him. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to find. Some part of me still hoped I was wrong, even after all the signs. But hope is funny like that. It clings even when it knows better. I drove 2 cars behind him, hands steady on the wheel, rehearsing lines in my head that I knew I wouldn't say. I followed him to a quaint little restaurant on the east side of town, the kind of place with lavender syrup lattes and wildflower centerpieces. She was already there, waiting. And he smiled when he saw her. Not the polite smile he reserved for coworkers, the smile that used to belong to me, the smile I hadn't seen in years. They kissed. Quick. Familiar. And that was it. Something in me broke and mended all at once. Not a dramatic shattering, just a clean snap. A realization. He wasn't lost. He had left. And the woman I'd become, tired, quiet, resentful, she wasn't who I was meant to be. I didn't confront him there. No public spectacle, no throwing drinks or screaming accusations. I drove home, closed the front door behind me, and let myself feel the full weight of everything. The betrayal, the years, the silence I'd tolerated. That night, I didn't speak to him when he came home. He didn't ask why. Of course he didn't. He thought I didn't know. But I did. And I was done pretending. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was heartbroken, though I was, but because my mind wouldn't stop. I kept replaying their brunch, the kiss, the way he leaned in and laughed like a man who hadn't left his wife at home doing the dishes, like a man who hadn't hollowed out a marriage with half-truths and meetings. I waited until Sunday morning. Our son was at a sleepover, and for once the house was quiet. Still. He came into the kitchen, hair tousled, barefoot and humming some jazz riff he'd picked up from a playlist. He smiled at me, reaching for the coffee pot like everything was fine. I set my mug down and said his name. Daniel. He looked up. Yeah? I met his eyes. How long have you been seeing her? The air changed. Everything in the room tensed, like the walls themselves knew this was it. He froze, mug in, hand, eyes narrowing slightly. What are you talking about? I didn't waver. Lena, blonde, works in marketing, likes lavender lattes. You kissed her outside Cafe Arlo yesterday at 11:46 a.m. He went pale. You followed me? That's your takeaway? I asked, my voice sharper now. That I followed you? Not that you've been lying to me, cheating on me. He set the mug down with a quiet clink. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. He didn't deny it. Of course he didn't. There was no way out now, and he knew it. I didn't plan for it to happen, he said finally. It just evolved. Evolved? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so typical, so rehearsed. You evolved into a liar then? Into someone who kisses another woman while telling his wife he's in a meeting? I've been unhappy, Claire. There it was. The excuse. The one that always comes. The subtle blame, dressed up like vulnerability. I've been unhappy too, Daniel, I said, stepping forward, my voice steady. But I didn't cheat. I didn't disappear into someone else's arms and call it an accident. I stayed. I showed up. You left while pretending you were still here. He ran a hand through his hair. It wasn't about her. It was about me. Feeling like I mattered again. And there it was again. Me, me, me. Always about him. I gave up so much for this family, I said quietly. My career, my time, my dreams. I did it willingly, but God help me, I thought we were doing it together. You let me carry the weight while you chased validation in someone else's bed. I'm sorry, he said, but it was automatic. Empty. The kind of sorry you say when you've been caught, not when you're truly remorseful. I don't think you are, I replied. And even if you were, I'm not sure it matters anymore. He looked at me then, really looked. Maybe for the first time in years. And what he saw, I don't know. But it wasn't the soft woman who used to cry when he raised his voice. It wasn't the passive partner who let things slide in the name of peace. It was someone else now. Someone waking up. I don't know what you want from me, he said. I don't either, I admitted. But I know what I want for me. Space. Clarity. Peace. He opened his mouth, maybe to beg, maybe to argue, but I raised my hand. Not now. Maybe not ever. There was silence then. A thick, aching silence. But I didn't feel it this time. I let it stretch. And for once, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. I wasn't afraid of being alone. Because I wasn't broken. I was awake. The silence after the confrontation wasn't just in the house. It was inside me too. A wide, echoing quiet. Like standing in an empty cathedral long after the service is over. The kind of silence that holds reverence and grief in equal measure. Daniel stayed in the guest room that night. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to explain anything else. Maybe he sensed there was no point. Or maybe he knew that any words he spoke now would only bounce off the emotional wall I'd finally built between us. I woke up early, out of habit, made coffee. But this time, I didn't make his. I didn't lay out vitamins, didn't check his calendar or organize our son's schedule to accommodate Daniel's meetings. It wasn't anger driving me, it was detachment. A quiet, sobering clarity. I took my mug to the back porch and sat alone in the crisp morning air. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself, when did I stop being a woman and become just the structure that held everything together? Because that's what I'd done, hadn't I? I had been the planner, the peacekeeper, the one who remembered birthdays, scheduled dentist appointments, kept track of school projects, and made sure everyone had clean socks. I had been so busy holding everything up that I hadn't noticed the foundation beneath me cracking. Or maybe I had. Maybe I just didn't want to admit it. Because if I admitted it, then I'd have to face the truth. That the man I loved had become a stranger in plain sight. I thought about our history. 14 years is a long time. We weren't kids when we married, but we still believed in the forever kind of love. And for a while it worked. We had our good years. Early mornings feeding our son, late night takeout after long days, movie, marathons in bed. We had laughter. We had shared dreams. But somewhere in the middle of mortgage payments and career stress and growing older, we started drifting. And I don't think either of us knew how to reach across that widening gap. So we didn't. And when people don't connect, They start seeking connection elsewhere. That's the part that still hurt. Not just the infidelity, but the fact that when he needed something, comfort, validation, affection, he didn't turn to me. He turned away from me. I cried then. Not loud, ugly sobs. Just tears that slipped down silently, as if my body was finally releasing what my mind had carried for far too long. I wasn't mourning him. I was mourning me. The version of myself I'd buried under compromise, under silence, under the constant tending to everyone else's needs but my own. I cried for the woman who once had dreams of opening her own design studio, who used to sketch on napkins at cafes and get excited about Pantone swatches. I cried for the woman who thought love meant sacrifice, even when it became one-sided. I cried for all the nights I lay awake wondering why I felt so alone, even with someone sleeping right beside me. And then I stopped crying. Because there was nothing left to grieve. Only something left to rebuild. Later that day, I texted my sister. "Can I come stay for a few days?" No explanation. She replied within 2 minutes. Of course. Always. I packed a small bag, just essentials. I didn't tell Daniel where I was going. Let him wonder. Let him sit in the stillness I had lived with for so long. Before I walked out, I paused at the front door. This house, this life, it had been mine. Ours. And maybe I'd come back to it in a different form. Maybe not. But one thing was clear. I was no longer going to shrink myself to make it work. As I drove toward my sister's place, the weight started to lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe, enough to see a future that was still mine to shape. And that realization? That was the first moment I felt free. My sister didn't ask many questions when I arrived. She just opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me into the kind of hug that wraps around you like a blanket. I stayed in her guest room, really just a spare room with a daybed and too many boxes, but it felt like sanctuary. Safe, quiet, uncomplicated. For the first 2 days, I did nothing but sleep, sip tea, and stare out the window. My phone buzzed a few times. Daniel had sent a handful of messages, some apologetic, some confused, some almost angry in their desperation, but I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to have a conversation when I hadn't even finished having one with myself. On the third morning, I woke up with the sun pouring in, casting gold across the ceiling. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't waking up in dread. I wasn't thinking about his schedule, our bills, the next thing that needed fixing or smoothing over. I was thinking about me, and that terrified me. Because when you've lived for other people long enough, thinking of yourself feels wrong. Selfish. But as I lay there, I realized something. No one else was going to choose me if I didn't choose myself first. So I got up, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat with a notepad I found in my sister's junk drawer. I started writing. Not a journal entry, not a list of pros and cons, just questions. What do I want that has nothing to do with being someone's wife or mother? What would I do if I wasn't afraid of starting over? When was the last time I felt proud of myself? The answers didn't come quickly, but they came. I wanted to design again. I wanted to feel excited to wake up and create something beautiful. I wanted space, physical, emotional, mental, to rebuild the parts of me I had silenced. I wanted to raise my son in an environment where love was modeled through respect, not obligation. I wanted peace. That was the word that kept showing up in my scribbles. Not revenge, not even closure, just peace. I realized I didn't need to burn everything to the ground. I didn't need to scream or punish or chase apologies. I needed boundaries. I needed direction. I needed to reclaim my name and my voice from the static of a life that no longer fit. That evening, I called Daniel, not to reconcile, not to fight, just to speak, for myself. He answered on the second ring. His voice was cautious, threaded with nerves. "Claire?" "I'm safe," I said first, and I meant it in every sense. "I'm staying with my sister." He exhaled. "I've been going out of my mind. I didn't know if—" "I'm not calling to talk about us," I interrupted gently. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Silence. "I'm calling to let you know that I need time. I'm going to stay here for a little while. I'll be coming back to get some things. I'd appreciate if you weren't home when I do." "Claire, I know I messed up." "I know you did too," I replied. "But right now I'm not interested in dissecting that. I'm interested in figuring out who I am without all the noise. He didn't respond right away. Then quietly, do you think you'll ever forgive me? I paused. Maybe, but forgiveness isn't the same as staying, and I don't know what staying would even look like anymore. More silence. But I didn't fill it. I let him sit with it. After we hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I went outside, barefoot, onto the cool grass of my sister's backyard and tilted my face to the sky. I had no roadmap for what came next, no guarantees, no neat little resolutions. But for the first time, I was okay with that. Because I wasn't lost. I was in transition, and there's a quiet kind of strength in that space. I was becoming someone new, someone brave. A few days after our call, Daniel emailed me. Not a text, not a voicemail, an email. As if putting it in writing gave his words more weight, more permanence. The subject line was one word. Please. I hesitated before opening it. I already knew what it would contain. A man like Daniel wasn't used to being left. He was used to being forgiven, explained away, excused. He was used to things bending back into place eventually. The email was long, longer than I expected. He started by saying how sorry he was, not just for the affair, but for letting us drift. He said he didn't recognize himself anymore, that being with someone else had made him realize how much he'd been running from his own emptiness. It wasn't about her, he wrote, echoing what he'd said before. It was about needing to feel alive again, but I chose the wrong way to do it. I betrayed the one person who stood beside me the longest. He talked about our son, how he didn't want him to grow up with resentment between us, how he still believed in the family we built. He said he wanted to try counseling, space, whatever I needed. He wasn't begging exactly, but he was holding out hope like a lifeline. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. Here's the thing about betrayal. Once the glass is shattered, no amount of apology can make it whole again. You might glue the pieces, but the cracks will always be there, visible, permanent. And I had no desire to live in a house made of patched-up glass. Later that night, he called. This time, I let it go to voicemail. He sounded tired, defeated. But there was still a trace of expectation in his voice, like he believed I'd come back eventually because I always had before. I miss you, he said. I miss our life. I know I screwed up. But please, Claire, don't throw it all away. I played the message twice, not because I was moved, but because I was studying it, listening for the words that weren't said. There was guilt. But not accountability. There was fear, but not transformation. There was longing, but not for me, for the comfort I used to provide. What he missed wasn't me. It was the version of me that made his life easier. The woman who carried the emotional load, who cleaned up the messes, who quietly swallowed her needs because his took up all the space. But that woman was gone now. And in her place stood someone who had finally remembered herself. The next day, I sent him a response. Not cruel, not dramatic, just clear. Daniel, I've read your message and I hear your regret. But I want to be honest. What you miss isn't me. It's the life you had before you got caught. A life where I did the emotional labor, where I made excuses for you, where I forgot my own needs so yours could be louder. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. Our son deserves to see his mother strong, and I deserve to live in a home where trust isn't broken and then repackaged with empty promises. We will co-parent, kindly, respectfully. But I will not come back. Please respect that, Claire. I didn't wait for a reply. I blocked his number, not to punish him, but to protect my peace. I left the laptop closed. I left the past behind. Because healing isn't about whether they're sorry. It's about whether you choose yourself when it matters most. And for the first time in over a decade, I had. I returned home 3 weeks later, not to stay, but to gather the rest of my things. I timed it so Daniel wouldn't be there. I couldn't handle any more emotional appeals or half-promises spoken through clenched desperation. Walking through the front door was surreal. Everything was just as I had left it. The dishes in the cabinet still stacked the way I liked them. The mail on. The counter had shifted but not been sorted. My favorite throw blanket was still draped over the arm of the couch, as if it were waiting for me. But it wasn't home anymore. Home was no longer defined by 4 walls or a shared mortgage. It wasn't about the echo of laughter that had long since faded. Home, I was realizing, had to start inside me. I packed deliberately without rushing, placing items into boxes with quiet care. I wasn't just separating objects. I was detaching from a version of myself I no longer belonged to. I didn't take everything. I left the furniture, most of the framed photos, the wedding china we never used. I chose only what had meaning. For me alone, my sketchbooks, the old coffee mug from my first design internship, the linen robe I bought in Italy before I became a mother. I was rebuilding something, and I wanted to begin with pieces that still felt true. Back at my sister's, I settled into a rhythm. Slowly. Unevenly. But I moved forward. At first, it was little things. Going for walks alone and not having to explain where I was going. Eating cereal for dinner without anyone making a comment about nutrition. Rewatching old design documentaries and letting my mind wander to ideas I hadn't entertained in years. Then came something bigger. One afternoon, I pulled out an old sketch pad from the bottom of a box. It was dusty, the cover creased, but the pages inside were alive, filled with lines and colors and the kind of raw creativity I hadn't touched since before my son was born. I didn't overthink it. I just picked up a pencil and started drawing. It was awkward at first, like flexing a muscle I hadn't used in years. But the more I sketched, the more I remembered the part of me that used to feel exhilarated by the act of creating. Not for money, not for approval, just because I could. Within a week, I had covered the kitchen table in paper and color swatches. My sister joked that she was living inside a mood board, but she was proud. I could see it in the way she stepped aside, gave me space, brought me coffee without a word. She knew what was happening. I was coming back to myself. I started reaching out to old contacts, former clients, colleagues, even a friend who ran a boutique and had once said, "If you ever go solo, I want you to design my space." I wasn't thinking in terms of a full business yet. But the idea wasn't as distant as it once felt. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't paralyzed by doubt or fear of what Daniel would think. I didn't have to weigh every decision against someone else's ego or needs. And it was liberating. Of course, there were still moments of sadness. Nights when I missed the sound of my son's laughter echoing through the old hallway. Mornings when I'd see a photo of him and Daniel at the park and feel a stab of guilt that this new chapter came at a cost. But I didn't let those moments anchor me. Because guilt is not a compass, and regret is not a reason to stay small. I was learning to rebuild not just a life, but a self. A self that didn't revolve around being someone's wife. A self that existed before the marriage, before the betrayal, before the years of slow erosion. And as I stood at the start of this unfamiliar path, one thing became beautifully clear. This wasn't just recovery. This was reinvention. One of the strange things about reclaiming yourself after a long betrayal is how unfamiliar your own reflection becomes. I noticed it one morning, brushing my hair in the mirror at my sister's house. There were more gray strands than I remembered, and faint lines had started to settle near my eyes. But it wasn't just age, it was the way I stood, how my shoulders no longer curled inward, how my eyes didn't flinch when I looked myself. Straight on. For so long, I had filtered my identity through my role as Daniel's wife, as Liam's mother, as a support system to everyone but myself. It had made me invisible, even to me. Now, I was learning to see myself again, without the roles, without the pressure. Just me. And I was starting to like her. With my sketching routine becoming more regular, I decided to invest in a new set of markers and a drafting tablet. It felt indulgent at first, like I was giving myself permission to take up space. But that feeling, bold and daring, was exactly the one I needed to lean into. I transformed the small corner of my sister's living room into a makeshift studio, pinned inspiration to the wall, set a calendar with deadlines only I was responsible for. It wasn't just play anymore, it was a reclamation. Then, I set a goal, launch a small freelance business within the next 6 months. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. It had been years since I worked for myself. The idea of networking again, pitching clients, managing invoices, it all felt like trying to jump into a moving train. But each time I hesitated, I reminded myself that fear and growth often arrive hand in hand. And I wasn't just building a business. I was building a life where I didn't have to shrink. I also started therapy, something I'd pushed off for too long. My therapist, Melissa, was patient and sharp in equal measure. She didn't let me dodge the hard truths, but she also helped me notice the patterns I had never questioned. "Claire," she said one session, You've spent years negotiating your worth. Every time Daniel pulled away, you adjusted. Every time he avoided responsibility, you overcompensated. But that isn't love. That's survival. And now, you get to choose something different. That truth hit deep. Because I didn't want survival anymore. I wanted joy, peace, self-respect. I also began carving time out just for myself. Walks in the early morning, before the neighborhood woke up, long baths with music and candles, coffee dates with friends I hadn't seen in years, women who welcomed me with open arms and no judgment. One evening, after a dinner with an old design school friend, I sat in the car and cried, not from sadness, but from the weight of gratitude. For every woman who had quietly cheered for me while I forgot how to cheer for myself. And for the woman I was finally becoming. I wasn't naive. I knew the road ahead would still have moments of grief and loneliness. But now I had tools. I had goals. I had a vision that belonged to no one but me. At the top of my new notebook, I scribbled a mantra in bold pen. I am not what was done to me. I am what I choose next. And that's what I held on to each day. When fear crept in, when doubts whispered, when Daniel's name showed up in a shared calendar reminder. Because reclaiming yourself isn't a one-time decision. It's a practice. A promise. And I was finally keeping that promise to myself. I never imagined joy would come back as quietly as it did. Not with a grand gesture or some life-altering event, but with the smell of cinnamon on a Sunday morning. With my son's laughter echoing off the kitchen walls, with a breeze through the window carrying nothing but silence and peace. Liam adjusted faster than I thought he would. At first, I worried he'd blame me for the separation. He didn't. Children are sharper than we give them credit for. He never asked questions about why I left or tried to put pieces together out loud. He just leaned in. On our weekends together, we built new rituals, morning walks to the bakery down the street, movie nights on the floor with popcorn and mismatched socks, drawing together at my little workstation, he on sticky notepads, me on my drafting tablet. He called it art dates. I never corrected him. And with him, I remembered how to laugh. Not the polite kind I used to muster when Daniel made some offhand comment during dinner parties, but deep, open laughter, the kind that felt like sunlight cracking through. One afternoon, while Liam was at a playdate, I found myself wandering through the local library, drawn to a community board pinned with flyers. Among them was a small, hand-drawn invitation, local creatives meetup, this Thursday. Coffee, art, conversation, no pressure, just presence. Something about it stirred me. I hadn't realized how much I missed belonging. Not to a man, not to a marriage, but to a circle of people who spoke my language, who didn't need me to translate my thoughts into something smaller. That Thursday, I showed up. The group was eclectic. A retired photographer, a tattoo artist in his 20s, a quiet woman who made earrings out of resin and dried flowers. They welcomed me with warm smiles and an extra chair. We talked about projects, color, palettes, artistic ruts. No one asked about my divorce. No one looked at me with pity. And then there was him, Jonah. He didn't stand out at first. Wore jeans, a threadbare sweater, glasses that always slid down his nose. He was a graphic novelist, soft-spoken, but wickedly funny when he leaned in. We shared a table, traded feedback on each other's sketches, and laughed about bad client requests. We didn't flirt, not at first. I wasn't ready. But I liked the way he listened, the way he looked at me, not through me. It had been years since a man looked at me like that and didn't expect something in return. Over the weeks, the group became a haven. It wasn't about escaping my life. It was about expanding it. One evening, after a long session at the cafe, Jonah walked me to my car. The night was brisk, the sky clear. He paused before I opened the door and said, "I don't know what your story is, and I'm not asking. But you carry something strong. It's quiet, but it's there." I didn't say much back. Just smiled and drove home with heat rising in my chest. Not from desire, from recognition. I was still healing, still discovering who I was. I didn't want to jump into anything, and he seemed to understand that without me having to explain. Back. Home. I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about how far I'd come, how light my body felt now that I wasn't bracing for impact every day. The joy I was reconnecting with wasn't flashy or loud. It was earned. It was in the way I stopped apologizing when I laughed too hard, in how I moved through rooms like I had a right to be there, in how I allowed myself to feel seen, not just by others, but by myself. This wasn't about falling in love again. This was about returning to a life where love, of all kinds, was allowed in. The call came on a Tuesday night, Daniel's number flashing on the screen like a name I used to know. I didn't answer. Not out of spite. Not because I was afraid of what he might say, but because I'd finally realized something simple and profound. I didn't owe him my peace. He left a voicemail. His voice was tight, rehearsed. He asked if we could talk. Said he'd been thinking a lot. That he missed us. That Liam deserved clarity. I didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, I waited until I felt calm. Until the urge to react gave way to a deeper need. To respond from a place of truth, not habit. 2 days later, I texted him. I'm open to a conversation, but it needs to be in service of clarity, not closure. I've already made peace with the past. Please respect that. He replied almost instantly, agreeing to meet at a neutral spot, an outdoor cafe halfway between his house and my sister's. I chose it intentionally, public, safe, no room for emotional theatrics. When I arrived, he was already there, nervously checking his phone, that old restless energy still clinging to him. I sat across from him without ceremony. No hugs. No forced smiles. Just truth. He started slowly. Apologies, regret, a few clumsy phrases about what we built and how things went wrong. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here for boundaries. I'm not angry anymore, Daniel, I said when he paused. But I also don't want to keep being dragged into emotional limbo just because you're struggling to let go. His face tightened. I'm not dragging you anywhere. I just thought we owed it to each other to... No, I interrupted gently. We owe it to Liam to be stable, to be honest, to respect each other. But we don't owe it to us to pretend there's still something to fix. That part is over. He blinked and I saw it, the moment he realized I wasn't waiting for him to choose me anymore. That door had closed, quietly, firmly. He tried to ask about Jonah. He'd seen something on Liam's tablet, a sketch of our group from the cafe. But I didn't engage. My personal life isn't your concern anymore, I said evenly. We're co-parents now. That's the relationship. And it was the first time I truly saw the boundary settle between us. Like a line drawn not in anger but in self-respect. After we finished our coffee, we discussed logistics, school schedules, holidays, the boring but necessary parts of shared parenting. He seemed relieved to have something solid to focus on. I left that cafe lighter than I had felt in years. Back home, I lit a candle and sat on the floor of my little creative corner, music humming low in the background. Peace wasn't just the absence of conflict anymore. It was an active choice. A discipline. It was in the way I said no without guilt. In the way I didn't explain myself when I wasn't obligated to. In the way I claimed space, not just in rooms, but in my own heart. And the more I chose peace, the less noise I tolerated. I unfollowed people who drained me. I stopped saying yes out of politeness. I released old guilt like smoke into the air. Liam noticed the difference. One night as I tucked him in, he looked up and said, "You seem happier, Mom." "I am," I whispered. "And it has nothing to do with anyone else. Just me." He nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. Because kids don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. Whole ones. The kind who show up for themselves as much as they show up for others. I wasn't done healing. I wasn't done growing. But I had reached a turning point. The kind where you don't just survive the storm, you step outside it. You breathe differently. You stop flinching at shadows. You realize the peace you were begging from others was always yours to give yourself. The future, once a blur of anxiety and what-ifs, began to take shape like the tentative lines of a new sketch. Delicate, uncertain, but full of promise. I sat at my drafting table one morning, sunlight spilling over fresh sheets of paper. No longer was I sketching to escape. I was sketching to create, to build. I thought about what I wanted, not just from a partner, or a career, or even from life itself, but from me. Who was I now, beyond the roles I had played? Beyond the marriage that fractured? Beyond the woman who had bent and broken beneath expectation? I didn't have all the answers, but I had a new question. What if I designed my life deliberately? I started small. I signed up for an online course in digital design, eager to sharpen my skills and connect with other creatives. I researched freelance opportunities and set realistic milestones for my business. At the same time, I explored interests I had shelved years ago: cooking classes, weekend hikes, volunteering at the local animal shelter. Each activity was a thread, weaving me back into the vibrant tapestry of life I had almost forgotten. Jonah remained a gentle presence, not a whirlwind romance, but a slow-building friendship that didn't demand more than I could give. We exchanged ideas, shared stories, and he cheered me on in a way that felt authentic and easy. With Liam, our bond deepened. He asked questions about my work, my dreams. We talked about his own hopes, becoming a scientist, a writer, maybe even an artist like his mom. Those conversations filled me with warmth and a quiet determination to model resilience, not just survival. There were days when doubt crept in, when loneliness whispered, when past fears surfaced. But I met those moments with compassion. I journaled, meditated, reminded myself that growth is not linear. One afternoon, I looked at my calendar and realized something profound. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in reaction to Daniel's actions or the past's shadows. I was living in pursuit of my own life. The possibility was exhilarating and terrifying, because reimagining the future meant stepping into the unknown with courage. It meant accepting that some dreams would change, some plans would falter, and some days would still hurt. But it also meant that I was the artist of my story. I held the pen, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to use it. Opening. My heart again felt less like a grand gesture and more like a quiet, deliberate act of bravery. I wasn't naive. I knew the scars from Daniel's betrayal ran deep. Trust wasn't something that could be handed out carelessly anymore. It had to be earned, nurtured, and protected. Jonah understood that better than anyone. He never rushed me or pushed for more than I was willing to give. Our conversations were slow, measured, like two artists sketching the same canvas, each stroke thoughtful and intentional. The first time I realized I was falling for him wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday evening, sitting on the park bench while Liam played nearby. Jonah pointed out the constellations above, and I felt a warmth that wasn't just from the soft breeze. It was the feeling of being seen, not as a project, a problem, or a wife past her prime, but as me. Vulnerability didn't come easily. I kept reminding myself that it wasn't weakness, but strength, to show up authentically, flaws and all. I shared parts of my story, my fears, my hopes, the messy aftermath of the betrayal. Jonah listened without judgment, his own vulnerabilities laid bare in return. Still, the shadows of the past occasionally whispered warnings. One night, after Liam was asleep, I caught myself spiraling, questioning if opening up was a risk I could afford. But then I remembered the promise I made to myself, to choose courage over comfort, even when it was hard. I told Jonah about those moments. He held my hand and said, "It's okay to be scared, but don't let fear write your story." With that, I learned to accept vulnerability as part of healing, an ongoing process rather than a destination. Love was no longer about losing myself to someone else. It was about finding a partner who respected my boundaries and celebrated my growth. And in embracing that, I found a new kind of joy, one that wasn't dependent on perfect outcomes but on honest connection. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, not just about love, but about life. There's a misconception that being alone means being lonely, but solitude, true solitude, became my sanctuary. After years of defining myself through roles, relationships, and obligations, I finally understood the power of being with myself, fully and unapologetically. I learned to listen to my own voice without drowning it out in noise, social media, endless chatter, or the need to prove my worth to others. Mornings became sacred. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world wake up as I tuned into my own rhythm. I journaled, not just to vent, but to explore who I was becoming. I practiced saying no without guilt, recognizing that boundaries are acts of love toward myself and those I care about. And slowly, a new kind of strength took root. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was quiet confidence, a calm assurance that I am enough, just as I am. When Liam would ask why I sometimes needed quiet time, I explained it was like charging a battery. Because to show up fully, for him, for Jonah, for my work. I needed to nurture my own well. This strength in solitude reshaped every part of my life. I noticed how I no longer chased validation from others, how I held my head a little higher in meetings, how I greeted myself in the mirror with kindness instead of critique. And when challenges came, as they always do, I met them from a place of groundedness rather than panic. The betrayal that once threatened to define me became a chapter, not the whole story. I was no longer running from pain, but walking through it, step by steady step. And in that journey, I found not just healing, but a fierce, unwavering love for myself. The day I accepted a freelance project that pushed my skills beyond comfort felt like a quiet declaration of independence. It wasn't just about work. It was about reclaiming my voice, my creativity, my future. Had spent years tethered to roles defined by others, wife, mother, employee. Now I was crafting a life that reflected me. With each new challenge, I discovered reservoirs of resilience I didn't know I had. The business grew slowly, fueled by passion and hard work rather than desperation. I celebrated small wins, landing a client, receiving praise, balancing a project while still being present for Liam. Life's messy beauty unfolded around me. Weekend hikes with Liam, quiet dinners with Jonah, lazy Sunday mornings filled with books and music. I found joy in the little things, a shared laugh, a blooming flower, the warmth of sunlight on my face. Purpose no longer felt like a heavy burden, but a light I carried inside. It was the fuel that pushed me forward when doubts crept in, reminding me that this new life was mine to build. And with that came freedom. Freedom to dream again, to love again, to live fully. The betrayal that once threatened to shatter me became the catalyst for transformation. I had walked through fire and emerged tempered, strong, and whole. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. And that made all the difference. The sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and rose. I sat on my porch, a warm cup of tea cradled in my hands, watching the world slow down. It was a moment of quiet, simple, yet profound. After the storms of betrayal, the waves of hurt, and the years of rebuilding, I finally felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Not the fleeting kind that comes from distraction or denial, but a deep, steady peace that roots itself in acceptance and strength. I thought about how far I'd come, how I had learned to set boundaries without guilt, to nurture my own soul without apology, and to open my heart without fear. I thought about Liam, his laughter echoing through the house, a reminder of the joy I fought so hard to protect. I thought about Jonah, the quiet kindness in his eyes, a symbol of new beginnings. And I thought about myself, not just as a woman who survived betrayal, but as one who reclaimed her story. This piece was a choice, a daily act of courage to live authentically and fully. It meant letting go of what I couldn't control. It meant forgiving myself for the mistakes, the doubts, the moments of weakness. It meant embracing the unknown future with hope, curiosity, and an open heart. I knew there would be challenges ahead. Life is never without them. But I was no longer afraid, because I had learned that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising every time, wiser and more compassionate. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, I felt ready. Ready to write the next chapter, not defined by betrayal or pain, but by resilience, love, and the unshakable belief in my own worth. And that, above all, was my greatest victory.